Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members of the bar. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend tonight's discussion, the Trump administration and drug policy. My name is Zara Levin-Fragasso, and I chair the Special Committee on Drugs and the Law here at the New York City Bar Association. It is my distinct privilege to introduce this evening's event and our committee. In 1986, the association formed the Special Committee on Drugs and the Law. Ultimately, the committee was formed to research and analyze why the criminalization of drug use, manufacture, and distribution had neither solved nor prevented the problems associated with manufacture, distribution, possession, and the use of drugs. The association tasked the committee with studying existing drug laws. The committee's findings and reporting the committee's findings and recommendations regarding the consequences that resulted from the practical implementation of those laws. In 1994, the committee broke ground by publishing the seminal report, A Wiser Course, Ending Drug Prohibition, which detailed the failure of existing drug laws to reduce the harms associated with the use and abuse of controlled substances. The report also examined and detailed the selective prosecution of persons of color and the poor for drug-related offenses. I would like to take a moment to note that we have one of our founding members here this evening who also still remains active on the committee to this day. He was also one of the authors of this landmark report. And he's here in our audience tonight. His name is Chester Solomon. If you want to, let's give Chester a hand. I would also like to take a moment to thank the committee members who worked tirelessly on this evening's event. Firstly, Noah Potter and Douglas Green, Heather Haas, and Sarah Yamina Chacon and Madeline Gauthier for also helping out this evening as well. Let's give everybody a big hand. It was really a communal effort. So a lot's changed since the committee released the groundbreaking report, A Wiser Course, Ending Drug Prohibition. That was back in 1994, well over 20 years ago. As lawyers, policymakers, activists, and citizens have found themselves in the midst of a mass incarceration crisis and opioid epidemic, citizens and lawmakers alike have been forced to re-examine the underlying stigma and assumptions associated with drug use and abuse, and have moved towards advocating for the implementation of laws and policies which focus on human rights and health instead of punishment when regulating the consumption of controlled substances. In the past over 20 years since the original report was published, much progress has been made on these issues. States have moved towards allowing the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes, and other states have allowed full adult use of marijuana. Syringe exchange programs have been instituted to reduce the harms associated with intravenous drug use. And more attention has been brought to the mass incarceration of Americans for nonviolent drug offenses, a mass incarceration that disproportionately impacts blacks, Latinos, and those individuals living at or below the poverty line. What is colloquially known as the war on drugs has largely been shown to be a war on the poor and people of color, the mentally ill, as well as those suffering from other ailments. It is a war that has neither prevented nor curtailed the harms it is sought to quash. In 2016, after nearly a decade of a more progressive federal drug policy than had been previously implemented in the United States to date, the American people elected Donald J. Trump as their president. Subsequently, President Trump selected Jeff Sessions as his Attorney General. Given the progressive advancements made in drug policy over the course of the Obama administration, largely at the state level, as a result of federal non-enforcement, many have been left wondering what happens next. Tonight's panel will look to discuss and answer some of the outstanding questions created by the uncertainties presented not only by the chaos that is unfortunately coming out of Washington, but also by the regressive criminal justice agenda espoused by Jeff Sessions. I do want to note that we invited the Attorney General to participate in this evening's panel, but he was unable to attend. We therefore extended the invitation to any qualified representative of the administration who could speak on these issues, but none was provided to speak at tonight's panel. Furthermore, recently our committee sent a transition letter, which there are copies here this evening, with 10 recommendations to the Trump administration. And so ultimately the issues researched and analyzed by our committee are nonpartisan. Anyone, whether they be black, white, rich or poor, Democrat or Republican, can be impacted by the harms associated with outdated drug laws and policies. Recently, I have heard the opioid crisis described as the great equalizer. This statement is true. Chemical dependence and death by overdose do not discriminate. As our country faces an opioid crisis, the likes of which we have not previously seen, the health of the American people should take precedence over partisan politics. The decades-long failures of our federal drug policies have succeeded only in increasing the American prison population and encouraging the spread of blood-borne diseases. When elected officials and lawmakers work towards implementing more humane drug policies, the evidence is clear. The spread of HIV, AIDS, and hepatitis C amongst intravenous drug users decreases. Overdose deaths are prevented, and lives are not ruined by a conviction for a nonviolent drug offense. Therefore, as the Trump administration pursues its agenda to make America great again, the committee urges the administration that greatness encompasses drug policies that are grounded in science, public health, human rights, racial justice, and compassion. In our letter to the Trump administration, the committee makes the following recommendations towards the achievement of a comprehensive, evidence-based federal drug policy, and I would like to take a moment to go over those recommendations with you now. We recommend to explicitly endorse and expand harm reduction-oriented approaches to drugs, including statutory reform to expressly permit and fund syringe exchange programs, safe consumption rooms, and safe injection facilities, all of which increase access to drug treatment and social services, and reduce the healthcare cost and spread of infectious diseases among intravenous drug users, without increasing intravenous drug use. These policies are critical to reducing the harms associated with the current opioid epidemic. We also recommend to work to make quality, evidence-based, medication-assisted drug treatment available on demand. Such treatment should embrace multiple pathways to healing by allowing people with substance use disorders to choose harm reduction and moderation in addition to abstinence goals. We recommend to remove marijuana from the Controlled Substances Act. We recommend to respect state sovereignty by allowing continued state taxation and regulation of marijuana within the guidelines set out in the memo from former Deputy Attorney General James M. Cole to the United States attorneys dated August 29, 2013. And we are very lucky, I'd like to note, that we have former Deputy Attorney General Cole. He's here with us tonight on this evening's panel. We further recommend that we remove federal criminal sanctions for drug use and possession of drugs for personal consumption, a position which is also endorsed by the Global Commission on Drugs, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Human Rights Watch. We recommend to increase funding for research and treatment of substance use disorders, specifically support the development of medications, including medical marijuana, and alternative treatment programs. We also recommend that to focus United States drug policy on promoting global public health and healing for people with substance use disorders instead of criminalization and incarceration. We also recommend to support international efforts to ensure that all countries have access to controlled substances for medical use and scientific research. We further recommend that this administration condemn Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte's mass extrajudicial killings, especially the killings of drug users and sellers, as a violation of human rights under international law. As a global leader on human rights, the United States has a moral obligation to condemn these horrific actions. The administration's recent invitation of President Duterte to the White House appears to endorse extrajudicial killings and should therefore be retracted. Lastly, we recommend that this administration that the U.S. government conduct a thorough review of the demonstrably ineffective and outdated International Drug Control Treaty framework and related UN institutions, and actively explore options for reform and modernization such that the evidence-based innovation is allowed and encouraged. The health and human rights and development and peace and security goals of the United States, as well as other UN member states, can be more effectively delivered. Tonight's panel will provide further insight into these topics and issues, and we do have copies of a letter available here and online. And so, without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening's program. That's Paul DeRienzo.
Hi, how are you?
He's the host of Let Them Talk. He's the host of Let Them Talk on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. And Paul will now open the panel discussion on the Trump administration and drug policy. Thank you, and I hope you enjoyed this evening's event, and a special thank you to our panelists for being here tonight.
Thank you very much. So, okay, well, I'm Paul DiRienzo, and I have a show on Manhattan Neighborhood Network every Tuesday at 8 o'clock. I'll give a shameless plug called Let Them Talk. And I also do Trump Watch on WBAI, which I would be doing right now if I wasn't here, but I have somebody else doing it. It's at live 6:30 p.m. every Thursday on WBAI 99.5 FM. And I have, as I can get it right here, a little sort of blurbs on everybody who's going to be speaking. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to briefly read the blurbs for each person so you know their names and a little bit about them. And then, because James Cole has to leave early, we're going to throw to him first and give him an opportunity to make a statement, and then we'll take some questions, and then he'll probably have to leave about 7, so then before that, although, we'll probably move on to the other panelists as well. So, our panelists are starting sort of towards the end. James M. Cole, who's a law partner with a large firm, but probably most importantly for our purposes, U.S. Deputy Attorney General, former U.S. Deputy Attorney General, and the author of the Cole Memorandum, which was the keystone document under the Obama administration, which brought us to the position we're in now of possibly losing to the Trump administration and that of the new Attorney General. We have Dr. Andrew Tatarsky, who's sitting right to Mr. Cole's right. He's the founder and director of the Center for Optimal Living, and he's been a guest on my show on numerous occasions and is an expert on harm reduction and well-known. Allan Clear, who's standing here, sitting to my left. He is the director of the Office of Drug User Health, New York State Department of Health, and an expert on needle exchange and all the issues of drugs and HIV, and probably a person of many people walking the streets alive today because of his contribution. So we give him a great hand for that and his contribution to this harm reduction world we're trying to create. Elisa Aguilera at the far end, and she's the co-executive director of Vocal New York, which organizes patients and others in the fight against, to mobilize their knowledge and experience, the folks who actually have gone through drug addiction and gone through the problems that we're going to discuss here tonight, and really do have a great, whose contribution is of tremendous importance. And Tess Borden, sitting directly to my left, a very distinguished person, American Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Watch representative, and she is the author, I see, of every 25 seconds, and we'll hear more about that. And so thank you all for joining us, panelists, and we're going to move forward because we have a lot to do tonight and not that much time to do it in, and we have to try and come to some, I hope we can come to some consensus as to the next move and what has to be done and what can be done to prevent us from being knocked back on our heels by the new administration. We don't want us to make the same mistakes that were made 30 and 40 years ago when Ronald Reagan became president and set back the what was then a very active drug legalization movement, which was set back and put in the box for decades after because there was not a strong response. And later on, we found out that through the Iran-Contra affair, that of course the people who were speaking out mostly against drugs were, it seemed, totally involved in their sale and dissemination. So that is not too surprising. Shouldn't be surprising to any of us here. So to begin, I'm going to go to James Cole. He was a former Deputy U.S. Attorney General, so he was an insider, a person who was there, who knows what goes on and knows the system. And he's going to tell us a little bit. I think we know maybe about his memorandum. He might want to refresh us as to what the memorandum was about and what were the situations that brought it to be, and where we're going to go from here now that we have somebody who seems to be dedicated, at least on the surface, to its repeal. But we had some discussions earlier that it might be a more complicated issue than we realized. So, James Cole, please.
Thank you very much. I think when you think about this topic, this is a very complicated topic, as I think we've heard in some of the introductory remarks today. And when we dealt with it at the time when I was in the Justice Department, one of the things that really struck us was that this is two problems. This is a health problem, and it's a law enforcement problem. And you have to make sure that you separate those two if you want to try and deal with this in any sort of sensible way. Because they're both involved and they're both very important, public safety issues and public health issues. When I came into the department, one of the first things that I was confronted with was that 1/3, roughly, of the budget that I managed at the department, and it was a $27 billion budget, 1/3 of it was for the Bureau of Prisons. Now, that takes money away from agents to investigate crimes, from lawyers, from other programs, from all sorts of policy issues, civil rights issues. It's an enormous amount of money. I sat down with the Bureau of Prisons. They told me how many people we had in federal prison at the time, which was over 200,000. They said the increase is roughly 6,000 to 9,000 a year, and it appears to be going on for the foreseeable future. And I said, how do we deal with this? I can't sustain this in my budget. And who are the people who are in prison? Who are they? What did they do? The vast majority are in for drugs. But the thing you have to understand is that some of them who are in for drugs are there because they make their living by killing people to be in the drug trade. They are dangerous. They present a very serious public safety issue. There were also a lot of people who were in there for nonviolent, minor drug offenses, sometimes first-time offenses. One of the things we also did in the Obama administration was a clemency project where we started looking at people who were in for a long time to see whether or not maybe they deserved clemency to shorten their sentences. And we literally found a number who, for a first-time, nonviolent drug offense, got life. Life. Others got 50 years, 60 years. And we started saying, for what? What's the purpose of this? I understand there maybe needs to be some consequence and there needs to be some punishment if you violate the law, but what is the rationale behind sending a nonviolent first-time drug offender to prison for the rest of their life? So when we looked at it, we started to look in terms of, so what are we really dealing with here? Because at the time a lot of these drug laws came up, there was a real epidemic of drug, gang, cartel involvement. The murder rates were off the charts. People thought the way to deal with it, not unreasonably, was to just start throwing people involved in this area in jail. But like everything else, something that might seem like a good idea at the time, you take a look at it 20 years later and there's some unintended consequences and maybe it's not doing all the things you think it should. We were dealing with drug addiction as a crime when it's a health issue. And that was one of the big problems that I think we confronted right away. When you have somebody who is addicted, and this may drive them to being part of a drug organization as well, just to feed their own addiction in one way or another, you have to start to take a look at, so why is this person in the criminal justice system? What brought them there? Are they bad? Are they evil? Are they killing people? Or are they ill? And they need some treatment rather than some punishment to deal with this. Are we going to have a better societal and public safety outcome? On the other hand, there are those people who are killing people, who are running violent drug organizations, and you got to get them off the streets. There's just, you can't not, because it is too big a public safety issue. So when the states, the first two, Colorado and Washington, passed their recreational marijuana initiatives, literally the day after, the governor of Washington, who was on her way out, came to see me. And she said, well, you see, this is what's happened in our state. And she said, are you going to now prosecute our simple possession cases? Because we can't. And I said, Governor, I don't prosecute my simple possession cases. Why should I prosecute your simple possession cases? Nobody does that. It's not worth it. And we started to then confront, because we now knew, okay, here are two states that are now legalizing recreational marijuana. There's a slew of states who had medical marijuana legalized. Their systems for regulating it usually weren't very good. They weren't robust. They weren't careful. They were very permissive and not really achieving the results they were aiming for. And so we started to look at what is our responsibility in the federal government in doing this, because we have the dual set of laws. You have federal laws, you have state laws, and they can both exist together. We started going back to, all right, what are the public safety issues that we see? Is it marijuana because marijuana is bad? Is that what we're looking at? Or is it that there are things that happen around the drug trade that are bad, that are public safety harms, that we ought to be dealing with? We looked at also the ability of, could we preempt what happened in Colorado and Washington? Could we enforce federal law exclusively in that area? And I sent people to look at that. And what we came up with was the decriminalization we could not preempt. It was explicit in the Controlled Substance Act that it does not preempt the field, and the states could do that. What I did here was, if you want to, it might be a little controversial and it might be a bit of an uphill legal battle, but you might be able to preempt the regulatory scheme, because that is fomenting a violation of federal law. So we thought about it a lot, and we said, well, why would we want to do that? Because what we now know is people are going to smoke marijuana in these states. People aren't going to be prosecuting simple possession cases, so people are going to smoke marijuana. That's just a reality. If you preempt the regulatory scheme, where are they going to get it? They're going to get it from the cartels. So now you're feeding a lot of money into the cartels, not a good idea. We don't really want to give them money so they can do that and all sorts of other bad things. The marijuana that the cartels send up into our country is filled with pesticides. You don't know what's in it. You don't know how it was grown. You don't know how bad it's going to be in any number of other ways. So that's not a good idea. If you don't have a regulatory scheme, you're not going to control who it's sold to. Children can get it. Other people who shouldn't be getting it. You can't control whether it stays in the state or not, or goes into other states that don't have it legalized and don't want it in their states. You're not going to necessarily be able to control that well whether it's grown on federal lands and becomes a huge environmental issue and, frankly, a public safety issue, because we were seeing in a number of instances where people were growing marijuana up in national parks, in remote areas of national parks. If hikers came upon it, they were killed, which is a huge problem. So we started thinking, what is the sense in trying to take down the regulatory scheme when we could basically wag our finger at the states and say, you need to have actually a good regulatory scheme? And here are the 8 or 9 things that we think are public safety issues, that if you take care of them, and they're most of the ones I just talked about, then we're not going to prosecute marijuana cases in your state. And in the same breath, we're saying to them, and you can make a whole lot of tax revenue out of this and really benefit your state in a whole bunch of other ways. All the money that would have gone to the cartels, going to the state tax coffers to do state public services. So this is the genesis of how we came up with this policy. It wasn't that we were sitting there saying, boy, isn't marijuana great and we ought to just get rid of all the marijuana laws. It wasn't that. It was very much an analysis of what's the public safety interest here? How can we make our communities and our societies safer now that we're confronted with this dilemma? And this had a great deal to do with trying to put this policy into effect. And I know there's been talk about this, of whether or not it's going to be withdrawn. I don't know. But it seems that I've been hearing some things from Attorney General Sessions that indicate that he thinks, I think one quote is, it's not that far away from really good policy. Or, gee, there's a lot of really valuable stuff in the Cole memo. Now, whatever ends up coming with it, I think a lot of the things that we've just talked about are starting to become apparent as people analyze. So where should the federal government be in this? How should they be occupying this space, and what is the interest that the federal government has in trying to get into this space, and where are we going with it? So there's a few starts to it.
Great. That's very interesting and a new and a fresh view from the inside. And maybe I'll begin, and folks should maybe formulate their questions, and we'll go to the audience in a minute. I have one question, and I think you gave a sort of an answer, began an answer that Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, the Attorney General, who is someone who frightens a lot of people in our position because he has made statements joking, but you don't know when somebody has so much power what they mean by a joke when they say, I used to like the Ku Klux Klan till I learned they smoked marijuana. So is that something we should take seriously? And some of the statements he has made about telling his prosecutors to go for the maximum sentence, to reverse policies that look for maybe the minimum possible sentence, to reinstitute mandatory minimum sentences, to refill the prisons with people going of mostly brown and non-white people, to take the fall for drugs when we know that the upper middle class white people of America are by far the greater users of drugs.
I think those are two separate issues, frankly. I think what Attorney General Sessions does with the marijuana policy is a separate issue from what he's doing with the criminal justice system.
I see.
Because I think you can't always take a quip as policy. Lots of people make quips, and what ends up coming out in policy, hopefully, is something that's done through some thoughtful discussion. It starts to boil up from some of the people who are really involved in it day to day within the Department of Justice, coming up with ideas, working on some of the legal issues that come with it, analyzing where we are and where we go in some of the issues that I talked about. So there's lots of things that the Attorney General has said. We'll have to see where he goes with policy and what he does in that regard as far as the legalization and the federal role in that of cannabis. Criminal justice system is something different. I don't think he was sitting there saying he's going to prosecute every possession case that comes his way. The federal government hasn't done that for a very, very long time. And even under Attorney General Ashcroft, who really set out the model that Attorney General Sessions may be heading back towards, wasn't prosecuting every marijuana possession case there was. Really what the policy went for is the people we're going to prosecute, we're going to throw the book at them. We're going to charge them with the most serious offense we can, and we're going to give them the most serious sentence we can. This was something that Attorney General Holder and I tried to pull back by saying, no, let's be thoughtful about it. Some people should go to jail for a long time. Others should not. Let's give the discretion back to our prosecutors who are on the streets and know better what's going on as to which is which, and allow them to have the discretion that only they can have because they're familiar with the case. I can't sit in Washington and say, here's a specific case in New York City, do this to it. I don't know enough about the case. I need the prosecutor on the street who knows enough about the community, knows enough about the specific gang or cartel that's involved, that can tell me the guy's a runner, the guy's a lookout, the guy's a nobody, he's nonviolent, or he's a kingpin. Where does he belong on this spectrum? And that's going to have a lot to do with what should happen to that person as a result of an arrest.
Well, one thing where the federal government could obviously have a lot of effect is in the money. The situation where these states that have legalized marijuana instituted actual, whether they be in California buyers clubs or actual stores like in Washington State and Colorado where you can go and buy marijuana, people being forced to send cash with runners because they're afraid to use banks because the federal government, the federal government could have a lot of power, the Justice Department, in disrupting any method of actually having a legal marijuana business.
Well, this was the second Cole memo, which came out after the first one. I did it with FinCEN, and it was to say you can bank this money, and if your clients who you're banking for are in compliance with the Cole memo, you will not be charged with money laundering. Because there is another public safety issue out there when you're dealing with that much cash. And that public safety issue is somebody's going to try and steal it from you. And most of the time, they're going to try and use a weapon to do it because it's probably the most effective way of stealing it from you. It also keeps the states from being able to account for how much revenue is really going through the industry and how many taxes ought to be charged on it. So there's a whole host of reasons why you want this in the banking system. Public safety and public revenue being two of the big ones.
Okay. I'd like to take a moment. Actually, I have one more brief question, which is, well, actually, let me go to the panel, and let me open to the panel, and if the panelists have any questions in the time we have left to direct to the former Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, please go right ahead. Andrew, you look like you're looking there. You're deep in thought. Would you have a question? Anybody have a question on the panel? None. How about in the?
I do, actually.
Yeah, go ahead. Andrew Tatarsky.
You know, given your experience on the inside and some knowledge of the people that are now in government, I think many of us are wondering, how can we have constructive dialogue? How can we have input into the policies that are going to, you know, that are being considered right now?
Well, you know, again, it's there's a number of different ways. One is to try and through an organization like this or the American Bar Association, I know we in a number of administrations have had dialogue groups through different bar organizations that go in and meet with sometimes very high-level people in the Justice Department to talk about a slate of different issues and try and provide some insight. Letters that state positions and give foundations for those positions. Doing it through members of Congress. They tend to be heard a little bit more inside the halls of the Justice Department because they control the Justice Department's budget. And that gives them a certain louder voice, so to speak. So there's a lot of different inflection points that can come in to be able to say, these are some thoughts we have about what might be, frankly, a practical and a useful and an effective way to deal with some of these problems. And I think there can be some very open dialogue in that regard. Again, it all depends on the people. I know the Deputy Attorney General, the person who has my job, Rod Rosenstein, I've known him for years and years and have worked with him for many, many years. Very reasonable guy. He's conservative, but he is reasonable, and he understands what public safety issues are and what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And my guess is that he is certainly somebody who not only is in a position to impact policy, but would understand what some of the better arguments are for trying to formulate that policy.
Any other questions from the panel? I have one brief question because we know that drugs are scheduled, and there's a scheduling system of which marijuana, for example, has been put in Schedule 1 and therefore has no accepted medical value. And yet, you know, just last night I was watching about and seeing children with terrible illnesses basically cured, up to 90% or 100% cured by the use of cannabidiol, which are, even though they don't get you high and don't contain THC, are basically banned under federal law.
But you touch on a very, very interesting topic here, which is the issue of rescheduling. And it's a very complicated issue because it can be done one of two ways. Either through the FDA and DEA, which have been delegated the Attorney General's power to reschedule, or through Congress, through legislation. And under the Attorney General's power that's with DEA and FDA, they look at and do a study that talks about A, is there any known medical use? And B, what is the potential for abuse? Now, I actually, in the process of looking through this, read one of the long studies that they had done denying it. And they said there is no medical use for marijuana. And as I read further, the reason was there's been no testing. And the reason there's no testing is because it's a Schedule I drug. And because it's a Schedule I drug, the ability to test it is incredibly difficult. If it becomes a Schedule II drug, you can test it far more easily. It can be prescribed. It is still an illegal and controlled drug unless a doctor actually prescribes it, but the ability to test it, to find out if it has any medical value, becomes much, much more available than it is now. When you looked at the potential for abuse in the report, I was frankly surprised because it rated it as fairly low. They said there is an addictive aspect to it with heavy, heavy, consistent use, but getting over it is similar to getting over the addiction to coffee. It can impair the developmental abilities of children, and that has to be taken very seriously. It can, for short periods of time, impair cognitive abilities in adults. There's a whole panoply of things there, but it wasn't kind of the reefer madness that you might look for in a report like that. So really the key is trying to get this in a testing sphere, because I saw that last night too, and I had a lot of parents when I was at the Justice Department saying, why won't you let this happen? Obviously, that's a tough issue. Do you want to test a drug on your child that's not been approved by the FDA in the normal course? Probably not, but there are parents who are desperate. There's nothing else that even comes close to giving relief to their children, and so I think we owe it to them to try and get some actual testing of this drug, some real science behind it, so that we can find out, is this going to help somebody? And if it is, let's put it through the normal FDA process and get it out so it can help people. If it's not, fine, we'll move on. But to stick our head in the sand and say it's a Schedule I drug and that's it, is creating this cyclical inability to move it along or move science along.
I want to throw the questions to the audience, but I have one more brief one, and you might not want to stay long on it, but I feel I have to ask it. There's these reports that are coming out that marijuana, starting in the Nixon administration, the marijuana laws were used specifically to target anti-war protesters and other left-wing critics of the war in Vietnam. What do you think of those allegations based on tapes and things? And you don't have to spend that much time. I mean, I don't expect that we all know the answers.
You know, those are anecdotal things that come out, and you don't know which came first, the chicken or the egg in some of those things, so it's very difficult to try and figure out if it was done to focus on them. Certainly there has been an inordinate application of these laws to people of color throughout history, starting long before the anti-war movement. And so I think you have to look at some of those societal issues and try to at least figure out, is there some of that going on and what's motivating it? It's not all of it by any means, and there's lots of other things that operate in that space. But I think it's worth trying to figure out where are we going and why are we doing this.
All right, thank you very much. We have someone who I think began, the person in the gray there, in the gray jacket and a blue tie, yes. Blue tie. Okay, and you're next in the front because you wanted it. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I hold it? Okay. So my question is, did anyone with policymaking authority in Washington, D.C., when you were there, really believe that the Controlled Substance Act, well, that cannabis met the definition of a Schedule I drug under the CSA? Was it your sense that anyone really believed that it did meet all three requirements?
Well, again, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg. It gets scheduled, and to reschedule is then what you have to deal with under the law. The scheduling happens, and it can happen by statute. Congress can just say it's Schedule II now, or they can say it's Schedule I now, and they get to decide that. To reschedule is where the standards really start to come in. And this is where the vicious cycle happened. There was no ability to find whether there was a medical application for it because there was no ability to really test it. So that issue didn't really come up as a, should it be Schedule I? Is it really a Schedule I? I think a lot of people thought, it's silly to have it as a Schedule I because of the nature of it, particularly compared to a number of the Schedule II drugs that are there that are far more powerful, far more addictive, and far more disabling. But the reality is it is a Schedule I drug, so you either need an act of Congress or the criteria to reschedule.
All right. Thank you very much for that question. Gentleman in the white shirt, in the front.
My name's Paul. I'm on the Administrative Law Committee, this fine organization, and we have been taking a look at this topic from an administrative law perspective. Having been an avid reader of your memos, thank you. we are taking a look at the regulatory aspects of a lot of the statutes, well, the statutes that have passed and have been functional, particularly in Colorado, Washington, Oregon, and Alaska. Those that have, over the past years, beta tested the legalization of leisure marijuana in small quantities. Which of those, if any of those statutes, do you feel best matches up for largest populations to what it was dreamed about in the late aughts, in the early.
You know, it's tough. I haven't really closely studied the more recent regulatory regimes. I know that some of the early ones in medical marijuana states, you went into a doctor and you said, you know, doctor, every time I breathe in, I have this feeling like I have to breathe out, and you gave him $150 and you got a marijuana card. I didn't call that a robust regulatory system. So I think what you have to look at is some of the statistics that are coming out, and whether or not, you try to look at results, whether or not there is increased juvenile use, whether or not you see increased emergency room visits as a result, whether or not you're seeing involvement of criminal elements in the drug business. If you're not, whether you're seeing adulterated drugs, whether you're seeing all sorts of things like that, if you're not, you're probably getting a pretty good idea that the regulatory system is working. I was always asked when I first wrote the memo, how are you going to test this? And I said, you know, I'm just going to be looking for results. I'm going to be looking for some key indicators, but it's very difficult to test it. You're going to basically see, does it work? And if it's not working, I said, we're going to come in and prosecute, because then we'll see the kinds of things that we think are public safety harms, and we'll go after them. And you don't want us in your system. You'd rather regulate this on your own.
Another question. Dana, okay. Dana Beal.
Got to have a mic.
I'm gonna hold the mic.
Hi. You said there are two ways you can reschedule. Are you meaning to say that the President of the United States, last August, when they announced we're not going to reschedule it, which arguably may have changed the outcome of the election, the President of the United States has no power to just order it to be done? To say this is a Gordian knot, as you described, and I'm just going to slice it.
My understanding is, and I could be wrong, that the President of the United States didn't announce it. He may have commented on it, but he didn't announce it. The announcement came from the head of the DEA at the time, Chuck Rosenberg, who announced the findings that were published in the Federal Register of the study done by the DEA and FDA on the latest petition, and people can petition the government to reschedule, and then they do this study. And what came out was really the Gordian knot that we've talked about, and the solution that DEA gave at the time was, we will grow more marijuana under government supervision of testing quality so that we can make it available for testing, so that we can have a broader application of some testing that goes on. It still doesn't deal with the onerous conditions under which the testing must happen. But as I recall, under the statute, the President does not have the authority to reschedule. The Attorney General does, and the Attorney General has delegated that authority to DEA and FDA.
Okay.
No.
Okay.
Nor should the President be instructing the Attorney General.
Although I think that's an issue right now, whether the President can instruct the Attorney General has become an issue, but in a different sort of way. I'm going to go on this side. The woman, let's have a woman this time in the white shirt.
That's you.
That's you.
That's you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for being here. So, as you understand it, so long as an individual or a company is abiding by the state regulatory scheme, is DOJ enforcement essentially, or theoretically, not going to occur?
Under the current policy, that's correct. If they are in compliance with, and usually you're looking at a business that's doing it, you're not looking at the individual necessarily that much, but you're looking at a business that's doing it, either growing it, packaging it, selling it, marketing it, people who help the industry. Yes, I mean, my memo starts out by saying, understand this is illegal under federal law. We're not changing that, but it's saying if you comply with and do not violate these public safety issues that we have, we're not going to do anything about it unless there's some other thing that we can't even think of today that really is a compelling interest that we really need to push forward. Otherwise, no, we're leaving it to the states to regulate. That's where it is right now.
Okay. Person in the green shirt, the woman in the green shirt.
I have a question about when you wrote the memo. Did you experience any pushback, and do you have any examples of that, and how you had to deal with maybe prosecutors' offices or governors or whomever after they read the memo and enforcing it in the non-enforcement way? Did you have to kind of bring people to your side, or what kind of pushback did you see?
Well, before I wrote it, right after Washington and Colorado passed their resolutions, I got called up to the Hill a lot by a bunch of different congressmen, some saying, now you have to just stop enforcing the law against marijuana, and others saying, you have to really enforce the law against marijuana now. And I would look at them and say, last I checked, you were the Congress. Pass a law. You know, I enforce the law, you pass a law. Give me the direction by passing a law. They didn't. It's all over the lot, and what I found, and there was a couple of times where we did things that were, we thought, going to be sensitive. I found this one got fairly bipartisan approval and fairly wide prosecutorial approval, compared to when we rolled out the Smart on Crime program, saying, let's not always do a mandatory minimum, let's not always do a sentence enhancement. There was a big pushback among prosecutors on that. Some. Others were thrilled and thought it was a great idea. The marijuana memo was really not that controversial. DEA didn't like it. But that was probably the biggest pushback we got.
Mm-hmm. Another question. I'm going to go in the middle. I want to come back on this side. Steve Bloom. Yes, Steve. Oh, Mike, waiting for Mike, right?
Thank you very much. I read today that in Los Angeles or in California, some of the medical dispensaries are starting to sort of sell recreationally, kind of undercover, so to speak, or they're starting
to?
Starting to. Well,
Just now?
no, they're starting to sell to people without recommendations that you can come into the store. Is that where enforcement is going to happen? Is that where sessions would go after? They're going to look for places to go after to enforce?
That's very difficult to predict as to, first of all, whether or not the Attorney General is going to go after that kind of trade, because should it be left to the state of California to enforce that in the first instance? And, you know, if I were thinking I wanted to stop this, I'd probably go after some big business that's supporting the marijuana industry and shut it down that way, to make every other business that's supporting the marijuana industry afraid. As opposed to even going after the marijuana industry. You stop the business that's part of the infrastructure that, you know, gives them the ATM machines that are there that are not connected to a bank, gives them the packaging, gives them the scientific equipment they need for growing, the lights, the fertilizer, whatever it is. You go after them, and then that becomes the thing that will shut the industry down.
Okay. Here, Doug.
So one of the criticisms that's been leveled against the Department of Justice by people like Kevin Sabet from Smart Approaches to Marijuana and his co-founder, Patrick Kennedy, who's now one of the new appointees to the National Commission on Opioid and Drug Addiction, is basically, they've actually set up a new organization specifically to do what they claim that DOJ Maine was not doing, which was intensively monitoring the factors in the Cole memo in terms of what was going on. Do you have a response to that? I mean, it seems from your comments that the department was paying attention to making sure there wasn't spillover effects and adulteration and all the effects that you cited as potential grounds to intervene on.
Yeah, I think if they're, going in a genuine way to try and monitor the compliance with the Cole memo, I've got no problem with that. I put those factors in for a reason, not just as a make-weight to be a fig leaf and say, look, see, we're really serious about public safety. We actually were really serious about public safety. And if those things aren't being accomplished, I think we ought to know about it. I think the department ought to know about it. So I don't have any problem in that regard with doing it. I think part of what you need to keep in mind is that this is not something where you're just going to take a snapshot in time and be able to answer that question. I think this is a question that can only be answered over a period of time, looking at trends and looking at some of the statistics that you try to come up with that'll be meaningful. So I think it's a difficult process, but if somebody's able to do it in an effective way, I would applaud that.
We have about 7 minutes left, so if we could move quickly with get as many questions in as we can in the last few minutes we have left. In the front here.
Hi, I'm the daughter of a prosecutor, and my mother is a prosecutor of juveniles in Rockland County for about 30 years. My question is, in states like Colorado, you see one of your key indicators, juvenile youth is dropping, but there's actually an uptick in prosecution of youth of color. How do you think that regulatory changes can be made to attempt to reduce these racial biases in law enforcement? Do you think they can be made, and if so, how?
I'm not sure it's a regulatory change. I think it's a societal change. It's who your public officials are, and who is being given the discretion in those prosecutors' offices to decide what the policies are. The role of a prosecutor, as you probably recognize because your parents were, is to really, and this is, I think, one of the most powerful positions actually in our government, is you get to decide who gets prosecuted and who doesn't get prosecuted. Even if they've committed a crime, the prosecutor gets to say, I will or will not prosecute you, even though I can prove that crime. And there is nobody who can second guess that other than the voters, by voting the prosecutor in or out. So it's not a regulatory issue. It's a societal and it's a public official issue.
A woman in the red dress.
About the Rohrabacher-Farr amendment?
Yes, I mean, there's a little bit of controversy about what it means. It basically says, it's a rider on the Justice Department's appropriations bill, and it's been on for several years now, that says none of the money that's appropriated to the Justice Department can be used to interfere with the implementation of medical marijuana laws in states that have passed medical marijuana laws. Now, the Justice Department currently says all that means is the state's action to implement their laws, while others have said, no, it means if somebody's using medical marijuana, you can't prosecute them either, and that's the controversy. I think there's been a case or two on it, nothing very definitive. Again, at this point, to me, that's an issue where why are we really worried about that so much if it's a really simple possession case from somebody who's using medical marijuana? Who cares? Maybe you want to deal with this person from a public health point of view, but it just, to me, doesn't seem to be an all-encompassing or compelling law enforcement point of view. Now, if you're going to use that in order to try and get at somebody who really needs to be prosecuted, then it might be an issue. The reality is sometimes you use statutes that are out there to go after really bad people because you can't get anything else. Okay. And that happens. And sometimes there's some utility. Sometimes it's abused. So that gets to the question we had before. What's the quality of your prosecutor and what are they doing with that discretion?
Last two questions. Yes, gentleman over here in the bow tie.
For Mr. Clear, do you welcome or are you afraid of the wiggle room that Mr. Cole is leaving a state in dealing with these issues?
Maybe I'll answer that after he leaves.
Yeah, good question. We'll keep that in mind. Okay, another question. Yes,
He'll
over here.
wait till I leave and then he'll answer.
Gentleman over here.
Good afternoon, good evening, Mr. Coles. You spoke about the DEA earlier and their method of testing and some type of, is there a collaboration with the FDA? And if not, why is the DEA making medical decisions in regarding to medical patients?
Well, there is a collaboration with the FDA. The FDA has the lead in trying to determine whether there is a medical use and medical efficacy for it, and the DEA is more looking at the potential for abuse, but both of them kind of weigh in together in trying to reach some sort of consensus on what that recommendation is ultimately going to be. And it's defined. It really is what's the potential for abuse compared to what is the legitimate medical use. And when you've got no legitimate medical use that you can point to, for whatever reason, you don't need much of an abuse criteria in there to overcome the test, because you don't really have much weighing on one side. So any potential for abuse can really sway the day in that regard. But both DEA and FDA are involved in this process. And again, the report that I read on it, I found to be pretty candid and pretty straightforward, and it didn't seem to have a real big thumb on the scale. I thought it was fairly well done. I thought that the result was the product of this cyclical Gordian knot that we've been talking about, and there was a level of absurdity to it, but it's what existed under the criteria. And I had to give them credit for being pretty straightforward on where it was. They didn't say there never will be or there isn't. They're just saying there's no test that shows this to us.
All right, we're going to wrap it up, this part of the show, of the program. I guess, use my prerogative to just say that if everybody in the government was as reasonable as Mr. Cole was today, we would have solved this problem many years ago. Would you like a minute or two to wrap up before you leave?
No.
All right, thank you very much for joining us, James Cole.
Thank you all very much.
So it's 7 o'clock, and we're going to move on to the next part of our program, which is to give our other panelists an opportunity to make their statements and to handle your questions and my questions as well. And maybe we'll go to the next person, Elisa Alguera, right?
Sure.
And
close enough.
Close enough? Okay, sorry about that. And she is from Vocal, New York, and maybe you could explain a little bit about Vocal, New York, and why you think it's important to be at an event like this.
Sure. So thanks so much for having me. So Vocal New York is an 18-year-old grassroots community organizing group. We build the power of low-income people who are impacted by HIV/AIDS, Hep C, the war on drugs, mass incarceration, homelessness. We're based in Brooklyn, but we're statewide, so we have chapters in Westchester and Albany, and expanding, hopefully, across the state. And in addition to doing, the vast majority of what we do is policy, organizing, but we also do have a direct services component. So we operate a syringe exchange out of our office on 4th Avenue in Brooklyn near the Barclays Center, and do outreach, overdose prevention, syringe exchange throughout Brooklyn mostly. So, I mean, I think a couple of things maybe that just to talk about that perhaps are interesting to this group and that we're really starting to think about is this notion that prosecutors really do have a lot of discretion in the way that laws are enforced, the way that our criminal justice system operates here in New York City, and what can we do to really influence that. And so in 2013, Ken Thompson, the late Ken Thompson, the DA of Brooklyn, instituted a policy where he was going to decline to prosecute low-level marijuana cases in Brooklyn, which was, something that was really welcome. 2013, we were still in the height of stop and frisk. Marijuana arrests were still, in the tens of thousands, and 90% of the people are Black or Latino. And I think that, when we're talking about how can we make change, and, it was fascinating discussion, but a lot of the federal sort of regulations and whatnot are not as applicable to the day-to-day work that we're doing on drug policy here in New York City, particularly around marijuana, where, we fought really hard for a pretty crappy medical marijuana law, right? You don't even have access to the plant. It's really limited as to who has eligible conditions. And, for our purposes, too loud, sorry. And for our purposes, a lot of our folks who are low income, aren't able to afford sort of these regulatory models that exist in New York City, and frankly could get marijuana a lot cheaper on the street, right? And so when we're talking about what can we do in New York City, I think it's important that, you know, we have these politicians, we have Bill de Blasio, we have Andrew Cuomo, who are really trying to make a name for themselves to push back on the Trump administration. But what they're not really doing is making the change that we want to see right here in our communities. In New York City, for instance, overdose deaths for opioids are at record highs. And today in the Bronx, the NYPD cleared out an area called The Hole, where people who use drugs live, and homeless encampment essentially. And the police went, cleared it all out. That's and because it's a public safety issue in their mind, right? And so I think you're still seeing the over-enforcement of drug users. In the most recent budget to address the opioid crisis, the vast majority of the money that Mayor de Blasio is putting into the program is going to the NYPD, right? Parts of it is going to public health and to harm reduction, which is great, but a lot of it is still going into enforcement. And I think that's something, you know, that we're really trying to create a wedge between. You can't have public safety and law enforcement knocking on the heads of the same people who are supposedly the ones that you need to help. So that's a lot of sort of the thinking that we're doing. Part of our whole idea is that people who use drugs are the closest to the problem, should be the ones closest to the solutions, and involved in every sort of aspect of the policy making that's happening. So we're trying to grow. We're trying to also talk a little bit about the racial dynamics of the opioid crisis, right? Black and Latino people who said, this has been something that's been killing our communities for 20, 30 years, but now that it's happening in white, suburban, rural communities, suddenly it's a public health issue, right? And that's a real conflict and something that is really hurtful to a lot of the folks that we work on. But at the same time, we see this as a political opportunity to really move forward public health approaches to drug policy, building those bridges. I think we have, we did a tour recently in Rochester, Syracuse, Buffalo, Poughkeepsie, the Hudson, other parts of the Hudson Valley, to really make those connections between communities, because ultimately the war on drugs is a war on people, and you know those Black and Latino people have been hurt the most by that war, but it's not just them, and we need to sort of figure out what those bridges are, what's the political opportunity, and that's a lot of the work that we do every day, and we'd be happy to continue. We know there's lots of good people from the New York City Bar Association that have helped and supported our issues, and as we go to Albany and continue to advance these types of policies, we'd be happy to work together.
All right, thank you. And what we're going to do is come back. We're going to come back for some more questions. I'm going to give folks a chance to introduce themselves. They've been sitting so patiently for the last hour. Andrew Tatarsky, who I have the honor and pleasure of knowing very well, who is a harm reduction psychotherapist who is out there on the front lines helping people learn to control their drug use without having to quit if that's what they don't want to do, or quit if they do. So it's a very interesting approach to drugs, very different from the law enforcement one we were just discussing moments ago. So Andrew, let me throw it to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm a clinical psychologist and a clinician. I've been working with drug users for over 35 years. And what I've come to is a perspective that I think I'm going to share with you briefly, which I think is being increasingly embraced by clinicians across the country. And essentially that perspective is that we're in the midst of a scientific revolution in the way that we think about problematic substance use and the way that we need to treat it, or we need to address it. There's a particular addiction recovery narrative that is dominated, in which we see addiction as a disease, a unitary disease with a unitary course that is permanent, progressive, only arrested by complete and total abstinence. And that model then suggests an abstinence-only treatment system, which is really our dominant treatment system. And as a clinician, over these last 35 years, I've seen firsthand how what an abysmal failure that treatment approach is. So there's two parts of that. One is the model for understanding, which is that old disease model, and the other is the abstinence-only treatment system. And what I think is a much more realistic way of thinking about problematic substance use, a way that really explains the data, both of the failure of what's gone on, but also of how to really understand this really huge, diverse, multiply dimensional population of people that struggle with drug use, is that we need a new model. And I'm calling this a psychobiosocial model, in which it's not just biology or just trauma and psychological issues or just social circumstances. There's typically an interplay of these factors which is unique to each person, such that we need to create a treatment that can personalize the exploration or the understanding of those unique factors, and we can come up with highly personalized plans for change. Before I get into some of the details, I'm going to be really brief. We only have 7 minutes or so. But I want to say that I'm also part of a movement of treatment professionals that has put together a letter that essentially describes a lot of these ideas to the Trump administration. And part of the support for my claim that the field is moving toward these ideas is that we've got a large number of people that have signed on to the letter, many of whom are really leading figures, clinicians, researchers, educators in the addiction field, who are also supportive of this. But essentially, just like the former deputy said, we believe that substance use is a health and human rights issue. It's not a criminal or moral one. And therefore, we really strongly believe that we need to decriminalize quickly and move toward legalization and regulation, because the major harm to our drug-using citizens comes from the drug war and the criminalization of drugs, both in terms of the punitive policies and in terms of access to adulterated drugs of unknown potency which kill people. And that's really what's happening now in this opioid overdose epidemic with fentanyl. So, I mean, I think a second pillar of drug policy reform needs to be that we need to make comprehensive treatment available to all people, regardless of their ability to pay. And, of course, if we decriminalize and de-emphasize punitive criminal justice policies, we'll certainly have more than enough money to pay for that comprehensive treatment system. However, a treatment system that's dominated by this disease model, abstinence-only approach has been an abysmal failure. It doesn't address the needs of the majority of people who struggle with drug use. And the majority of those folks are in what we might think of as pre-action stages of change. Here's a question I ask professionals all the time. At the point at which you become concerned, a person becomes concerned about their drug use, what percentage of that population is ready, willing, or able to embrace abstinence? Stop. Probably 0, maybe 5%, maybe 20%. But the overwhelming majority of those folks are at a place where they need a treatment system that's organized around harm reduction. And what harm reduction is really a set of principles. Most people think about harm reduction as a set of strategies, syringe exchange, overdose prevention, and so on. But actually, it's a framework for thinking about how we can create treatments that really meet people where they are. We meet people on their terms, around their motivation, around their positive change goals. And that's a framework that can inform the entire treatment system, making treatment relevant and meaningful to people across that entire spectrum of diversity that I was describing. So bad treatment is often worse than no treatment. If we're actually going to decriminalize, we need to completely reform the treatment system to be framed by harm reduction principles, so that at whatever point a person is ready to begin the positive change process, the treatment system has a treatment that's ready to meet them there, engage them in beginning a process of positive change. So that, there are a number of, so the treatment system needs to be informed by harm reduction, but we also need to have a comprehensive system that's integrative, that can, personalize the assessments and bring to bear biological, psychological, and social interventions in a way that's uniquely tailored to each person. And I think this comprehensive system is a system that will be able to engage people across the entire spectrum. So treatment, that is drug policy reform, needs to go along with comprehensive treatment system reform that will integrate a harm reduction framework and comprehensive integrative services that meet people across that entire spectrum. So thank you.
Very interesting, and I think very, when we think about just how big a jump that is from the traditional model of throwing people in jail by the millions over decades with an approach that not only sees it, because I often see folks use the term, it's a health problem. A human rights problem is more like it, because we don't tell people, or we are beginning to tell people not to eat trans fats. We don't make a law saying you can't eat trans fats. We say you can't put trans fats in the food, and nobody tells people they can't eat trans fats. If a person decides, as as an adult, a free adult in America, to do what they wish as long as they don't hurt anybody else. Whatever happened to that? I mean, that was great. Was that just grade school? And it was just a joke when they told me that in grade school. America means do what you want as long as you don't hurt anybody else. What's wrong with that? Okay, so, and that's just my opinion. Let's go on to the next person. I'd like to go to Allan Clear, who's sitting on our left here, and he works with New York State Department of Health on drug users' health situations in New York State. Maybe I'll begin by asking you to make your presentation from the perspective of what is the health circumstances of drug users in New York State today?
The health circumstances?
Yeah. Is it being dealt with? Let's put it in those terms. Is the
being
state?
dealt with? No, it's not. And I think that what Andrew and Elisa have been talking about, I work for this, let me frame it, I'll ignore your question, I'll come back to it in a minute.
Sure.
I'm Allan Clear, and I work for the State Department of Health AIDS Institute, and I'm the director of the Office of Drug User Health, which is, I've been there about 15 months now, and the department is 15 months old. And it brings together the work that the AIDS Institute has been doing over the last, probably since the late 80s, where they began to implement some harm reduction and health interventions. First of all, in treatment programs, they provided primary care, and then we started doing syringe exchange. Then there was getting syringes out to folks through pharmacies, and it was the beginning of the rolling out of naloxone and the overdose program and providing protection for people who use opioids. And over the last year, we've been doing work around making easier access to buprenorphine, as well as expanding the definition of what healthcare is for people who use drugs. Before I started working there, I worked at the Harm Reduction Coalition, which is a national advocacy organization, training and policy organization. Before that, I ran one of the first syringe exchange programs in New York City. And I think what we tend to do is say things like drug use is a health issue, but we don't actually invest in that. What we do is we say drug use is a health issue, let's invest in drug treatment. Or we say, let's invest in law enforcement, and we'll have a more compassionate response to the drug problem by changing the way that law enforcement approach arresting and prosecuting, et cetera. We also, look at prevention and address opioids, for example, with the prescription drug monitoring program. But what we don't do is look at the middle bit where people are using drugs and what their needs are. We don't think about how they get connected to anybody whatsoever. In many ways, I'm not even concerned about connection to social services. I'm concerned about a person who uses drugs, wherever they are on the spectrum, having someone they can relate to that is not necessarily a peer drug user. And I have no objection to anyone relating to a peer drug user who can support that person either. So my job within the State Department of Health, I think, is, the way I see it, and they might disagree with me at times, my job is to sort of institute some kind of consciousness and policies around healthcare needs of drug users throughout the Department of Health. The Department of Health deals with water supply, it deals with lead poisoning, it deals with all kinds of issues related to health. It doesn't concentrate on drugs. So it's sort of, even where I work in the AIDS Institute, we deal with HIV, we deal with hepatitis C, we deal with nutrition, we deal with a certain amount of housing, but we don't focus on drugs. Whereas the drug, what OASAS, the Office of Alcohol and Substance Abuse Services, is seen as the institution that is has the expertise on drugs, and it's a well-entrenched drug treatment system that a lot of money is funneled into. And I see my job as trying to rebalance that a little bit to say drug users need some kind of support while they're using drugs. And sort of similar to what Andrew was saying, I don't believe, first of all, treatment is not the answer. The treatment system is actually a problem. That you're more likely to die of a drug overdose coming out of drug treatment than if you never went into treatment to begin with. When we look at something like Suboxone or buprenorphine, it's looked upon as something that addresses opioid use disorder, which it does very effectively. It's a gold standard of what we wanted to use to address opioid use disorder. The way we approach it is what we're trying to do is stop people from dying of a drug overdose. If it addresses their opioid use disorder, that is great, but I want people to stay alive first. That's what I want to achieve for people who use drugs. Once they've tasted and used buprenorphine, if they want to cease doing other drugs, that's fine. If they want to continue doing other drugs and it doesn't hurt anyone else and it's okay and they can get on with their lives, that's totally acceptable too. So bringing those sort of opinions to the Department of Health is what I see our Office of Drug User Health does. And it's interesting because when I went in, I thought it was more about, I don't know what I thought it was. Actually, I'm not sure anyone knew what they were doing when they hired me. I thought it was more external looking, but it's actually much more internal looking and sort of doing harm reduction from the inside of a government institution. And it's not a surprise, I don't think, except it's a surprise when you confront it. You find out that the elected politicians are very political. The government is inherently conservative. And I'm surprised when Mr. Cole, that gentleman over there asked Mr. Calder, how did he deal with dissenting opinions inside the Obama administration? And I don't know if maybe he didn't quite get the question, or maybe I misunderstood the question. But I find that what we end up doing is there are many dissenting opinions within different institutions within the state, and it moves forward so slowly in such a conservative manner because we're trying to address all of those opinions at any one time. And it takes real leadership to step out of that and make a big difference. And I think that's where the politics of being a politician and being a governor and anyone else who wants to run for president, that's what they have to think about every time they do something or don't do something. And I think that's very germane to what the Trump administration is going to do. They're already, how right-wing can you be? But within that right-wingedness mentality or the approach they're bringing, they are also going to be stuck with being able to only move forward in incremental changes, I think, in certain areas. So in terms of drug policy, there's going to be big changes, there's going to be different approaches, but it might, I'm not going to say it's not going to be bad as we think it might be, but they are going to come up against some kind of an inherently slow-moving system.
All right, thank you very much. And so we're going to move on to, thank you, Allan Clear. All right, we'll come back. We have a lot of questions because you said you gave us a lot to think about there about what to expect from the Trump administration and the inherent conservativeness of government to hold to past ideas long after they're past their prime, and yet act as if it's the most important thing in the world because their interests are based on that. That's how they got elected in the first place. Very interesting. All right, Tess Borden is going to join us. She's all with the American Civil Liberties Union and Human Rights Watch, and she has a book and a film. And let's talk first and then show the film after, because we want to know more, meet you and know more about you and know about your book, which you can hold up and show people. What is that book every 25 seconds? What happens every 25 seconds?
Sure. How's my distance from the mic here?
Good, yeah. No trying to stay away from the popping peas.
No popping.
No popping peas.
Well, because I'm the last panelist here, I'll try to be colorful and show you a video also. This report was published by Human Rights Watch and the ACLU last October, and I spent a year researching and interviewing folks all around the country, inside jails, inside prisons, inside prosecutors' offices, inside judges' chambers, inside mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers' living rooms, in a lot of Denny's restaurants, trying to sort of understand the impact of the law enforcement approach to personal drug use and drug possession, not just marijuana, but all drugs, and just how harmful that and failed that approach is. And so our conclusion is that it's really awfully, devastatingly harmful. As was mentioned at the beginning in the committee's 5th recommendation, Human Rights Watch and the ACLU staunchly oppose the criminalization of all personal use and possession of drugs. And so this report lays out 8 pages of recommendations to various levels of government actors, including to state legislatures and the US Congress, to tell them it's time to decriminalize. So I'll talk a little more about that and show you a video, but first I want to make 2 sort of global points given the title and topic of tonight's panel. And the first is that obviously I'm really concerned. I'm really concerned about the Trump administration and Sessions' language and policies in particular around drug use and drug offenses more generally. I think we see how alarming it is, when Sessions talks about marijuana, even if we don't know yet what that policy looks like, when he implements a memo rolling back Holder's policy on sentencing for drug offenses at the federal level. We saw it in Trump's budget released, I think it was now last week, that gives quite a lot of money to the lock-em-up approach to drugs. And de-emphasizes the harm reduction and public health approach that we all would like emphasized instead. We hear it in the transcript that The Intercept just published of President Trump's phone call with the Philippines president, in which he said supposedly that the Philippines had done an amazing job dealing with their drug problem and that we have one here too. Of course, we all know that that job involved over 7,000 extrajudicial executions. So I have real concern about that kind of language. And I think there's real concern that that language can trickle down. Sessions is the #1 lawyer in our country and the #1 prosecutor. And so I think there's real concern that that sort of lays the groundwork for state and local prosecutors to reinvest in a tough-on-crime approach instead of a smart-on-crime one. We also know that it's not just language, that the federal government does have a lot of ways of influencing and directing the states and local law enforcement through the Bureau of Justice assistant grants, through civil asset forfeiture, through a number of different sort of mechanisms. So point 1 is cause for concern. I think point 2, though, is that this is really an issue of the states. That I work at the ACLU right now in the Human Rights Program and the Criminal Law Reform Project, and working to fight mass incarceration on a number of levels. And we know that the mass incarceration problem is an endemic one, it's an excruciating one, it's a hopeless one some days it feels like, but it's a state-based one by and large. And so I took this off my wall. I hope everyone's familiar with this. This is put out by the Prison Policy Initiative, and it's called The Whole Pie. And as you can see, the whole pie of that 2.3 million people that this country currently incarcerates is really mostly in state prisons and local jails. And so I think this pie is the reason I get up in the morning. I think this pie is really depressing. I also think that when it comes to drug policy and reform, that this pie may be, why we can have hope. because I do think there is real reform happening in the states. The ACLU is fighting it hard, and I think we're fighting it well. I think we're seeing constituents, we're seeing voters, and in turn their elected officials recognizing that, despite what some of my concerns are about the trickle down, that smart on crime really is the way to go. We saw, I think remarkably, on November 8th in Oklahoma, one of the reddest states, that the very same voters who voted for Trump voted on ballot initiatives that, number one, defelonize, so reclassified, all drug possession, not just marijuana, but opioids and cocaine and the sort of scary drugs, from a felony to a misdemeanor. And then number two, invested the money that was spent on prosecuting the felony level offenses, reinvested that in communities instead and training programs. And I think that the fact that those same voters can check the box for Trump and check the box for drug sentencing reform is cause for celebration, and we celebrate that. I think I want to echo sort of the role of prosecutors and how powerful they are in the system, both federally and at the state level. I think we're seeing increasingly that local and state DAs are pushing back even on Sessions' sentencing memo. I think it was last week that 30 former and current city and state prosecutors wrote an open memo to Sessions pushing back on that. We saw in Philly, I'm losing sense of time, I think it was May 17th. We saw in Philly in the DA election, Larry Krasner elected, who ran along with a number of other Democratic candidates on a sort of criminal justice reform platform. And the ACLU did, although we're nonpartisan, we did a lot of sort of education of our membership and the Philadelphia voters, and demanded that the DAs who are running for this most important office really make their positions on criminal justice clear. So I do think there is sort of cause for excitement, or at least to stay focused, an eye on the prize. Turning to the report, I'll say, though, that it's a really complicated ship to write, and that I think the way we do things is really wrong right now. And so you asked that every 25 seconds means that every 25 seconds in this country, someone is arrested simply for possessing drugs for their personal use. Every 25 seconds. And so that means over the course of a year, 1.25 million arrests are made, again, of people who are just possessing drugs for their personal use. And what's extraordinary to me about that is that, and what I think is not covered substantially enough in this discourse, is that that makes drug possession, again, for personal use, the single most arrested crime in the United States. That's more than all violent crimes combined. In fact, despite all this shifting opinion about marijuana, half of all drug possession arrests are still for marijuana, and that means there are more marijuana arrests every year, marijuana possession arrests at the state level, than for all violent crimes combined. And I say violent, actually, with air quotes, because there are problems around how we define violence. But it really, I think that shows sort of how misguided the law enforcement focus is, that we're spending all these resources, prosecutorial, judicial, law enforcement, but most importantly to me, human and community resources, on arresting for simple marijuana possession. So this report really sort of digs deep into the scale of the problem. We have lots of pretty graphs, no pie charts, but lots of pretty bar graphs, analyzing data that I got through FOIA requests at various state levels, and analyzing FBI data as well. The second point I'll make, and finding that this report makes, is that, not surprisingly, this is a problem of racial discrimination. We know around the country that a black person is 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession than a white person. In many states and many cities, that number is far worse. In Manhattan, where we are right now, a black person is 11 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession than a white person. That's extraordinary to me. And I'll add that we should have Latino data, but the FBI does not keep data on Latinos arrested. They count them as white, so that's a problem. The third point is that, these are not just arrests and, you're done with it. The knock-on effects, the collateral consequences of these arrests, and then when they, as they so often do, turn into prosecutions and convictions, are really devastating and sometimes lifelong, not just for individuals, but also for their whole families. As you all probably know, the consequences of just an arrest, but also a criminal conviction can mean, you lose your employment, you lose your housing, there are implications for child custody, you may lose your food stamps, it's just on and on and on. And so we're not just talking every 25 seconds about someone being handcuffed, we're talking about people's lives being sent into downward spirals and bringing their families and communities along with them. And finally, I just want to echo what Allan and Andrew and others have said, that this is really a public health conversation that should be happening and not a criminal justice one. And so in calling for decriminalization, Human Rights Watch and the ACLU are very much embracing the harm reduction approach and saying that our leadership and our elected officials should be as well. The last point I'll make is just that, we talk about, this report is about drug possession for personal use. I think it's sort of fallacious to pretend that you can draw a perfect little circle around this. I think we need to take on the prosecution and sentencing of all drug offenses and actually the criminal justice system writ large. And so a lot of the really disturbing findings that this report lays out, I think apply equally to the experience of many people, especially poor defendants, especially defendants of color in this country who go through a really broken criminal justice system. It behooves us all to take a closer look at that and keep fighting. So I've probably gone over my time, but I also have a 5-minute video for you to wrap up our panelist conversation.
Is somebody near a computer who can launch the video? Great, it's up there. Okay, and can we turn the lights down? Is that possible?
Every 25 seconds, someone is arrested in the United States simply for possessing drugs for their personal use. Around the country, police make more arrests for drug possession than for any other crime. Over 1.25 million arrests per year.
Corey Ladd is a 27-year-old man that got sentenced to 20 years for half an ounce of weed. No parole, no probation. Every single day in prison for 20 years for half an ounce of weed.
Massive numbers of arrests and aggressive prosecution for simple drug possession is ruining lives and destroying families.
When Corey gets out of prison, Charlie will be about 18 years old. Hi, Corey. I was just talking about how you miss out on the little things of Charlie's life.
I definitely don't think it's fair whatsoever. I wasn't hurting anybody but myself, and I don't believe that I should be taken away from my family for 20 years for it.
All U.S. states and the federal government criminalize possession of illicit drugs for personal use. In more than 40 states, possession of small quantities of drugs can be a felony offense. I met people who are prosecuted for tiny amounts of drugs, all for their personal use. Sometimes single doses, fractions of a gram, even residue in a pipe or an empty baggie.
The sheer numbers of people that we arrest and send to jail for drug convictions is unbelievable.
Stephen is not here with us right now because he's in prison. Stephen have wrestled with a drug problem for some time now. The last time he was arrested, I think it was for like drug paraphernalia. So he went to court and eventually they gave him 5 years.
Stephen was, at one time, he was the provider. His not being there has definitely impacted,
Blacks, whites, people of color, we all use and sell drugs at relatively the same rates. But we enforce our policies in these poor black and brown communities. That's where the arrests occur. That's where the unconstitutional stops occur. That's where most of our law enforcement shootings occur.
Despite equivalent rates of drug use, a black person is 2.5 times more likely than a white person to be arrested for possessing drugs. In some states, that's even higher. In Montana, Vermont, and Iowa, the ratio is 6-to-1. In Manhattan, a black person is 11 times more likely to be arrested for drug possession than a white person.
My client, she is looking at 20 to life for 0.5 grams of crack cocaine, which probably would be enough to get her high for maybe a day.
A lot of times when the urge and the thoughts came, I used because I've been on it for so many years, like over 30 years, you know what I'm saying? And I didn't know how to stay stopped.
She went to jail in the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s, and over the course of that time, any changes that have been made in that system haven't stopped her or helped her with her addiction in any way, I think is very telling.
Most people who use drugs never develop dependence, but for those who do, treatment should be available and affordable in the community. You shouldn't have to get arrested to get help. And the truth is, in most jails and prisons, the treatment isn't the kind of treatment they need.
Once you're incarcerated and you're convicted of possessing any drug, for instance, your life really goes downhill.
You start with your driver's license, your job, where you live if you're trying to get into public housing, voting, having custody of your children. The list goes on from there, but those are some of the most immediate social consequences and economic consequences from drug charges in a criminal context.
You can get over an addiction, but you'll never ever get over a conviction. It will follow you for your entire life and prevent you from thriving, from succeeding.
40 years after the war on drugs was declared, rates of drug use have not gone down. Instead, countless people have been funneled into the criminal justice system at enormous cost to them, their families, and the U.S. taxpayer.
These are people that could be very high, well-functioning members of society. They can be mothers and fathers. They can have great jobs out in the world and contribute, but instead they're just sitting in jail because nobody was willing to give them the time of day and help them even when they're asking for it.
In my opinion, it is not justice. The definition of insanity is to keep doing something over and over again and expect a different result. So maybe we should try something different.
It is time to decriminalize the personal use and possession of all drugs. This means changing federal and state law. The human toll of criminalization is out of control.
Charlie's going to be 5 in January. Corey went to jail in December before she was even born. So I think he's served his time. And I think it's time for him to come home and start moving forward and be the dad that he can be.
Thank you. Well, not much left to be said after that. My next job is to open really to the floor for questions. I have a few, but I think I can pepper them amongst yours. And many of you are in this business, have been defending people, and have your own stories similar to what we've seen and worse. So maybe you'd like to share them with us and to ask our panelists any questions you might have. Is there anybody? Go ahead.
I'll repeat my question to Mr. Clear. Do you welcome or are you afraid of the wiggle room that Mr. Cole suggests is available to state authorities in dealing with these problems?
I welcome any wiggle room, I think. But that wiggle room works both ways, right? So you can have a state like Washington State or maybe California that's going to wiggle one way, and you can have other states that's going to wiggle the other way. And I think it depends on the leadership in those states.
Any other questions? Yes.
Question from the doctor. You talked about different integrative approaches to this drug addiction problem. What is the time frame that you're looking to have your letter looked at, considered, and any other legal action thereof after?
Well, actually, we have been sitting on this letter now for a few months, sort of waiting for a moment when it seemed to make sense to kind of get it out there, and I think now is the moment. So we are planning to, we're right now trying to figure out the best way to get the letter, out to get attention. It's not, obviously, we're not involved with legal action. I think part of our mission is, and this is something I've felt for a real long time, that clinicians, that is, people that actually work with drug users or people who are struggling with drug use, I mean, I guess across that whole spectrum, know who these human beings are. And I think that we have a responsibility to speak up based on our experience and have input into the policy level. I think that these crazy drug laws and, you know, the kind of treatment system that we have is not informed by, you know, a real understanding of the experience of human beings that use drugs. And so we think that we who work with drug users and have some status in the culture have a responsibility to speak up. So that's kind of where this effort is coming from.
Question?
Thanks to all the members on the panel for being here. It's very, very refreshing to hear you all speak. My question is for Ms. Borden. You know, when you see these different, you know, these very different rates of arrests for people of different races, how do you go about and change the culture of policing and the, you know, culture of selective prosecution? Because in a place like Manhattan, for example, that I think it comes down to that. I don't know if you agree.
I think it depends who the we are. At the ACLU, we sue them. And so we've brought some really exciting lawsuits. We're suing the Milwaukee Police Department for their stop and frisk and racial profiling policies and practices. We just sued in Mississippi around this really horrific roadblock and checkpoint policy that they have, where they're literally stopping black and brown people at checkpoints, and you have to pass through those checkpoints multiple times to get home or to take your kids to school. I am not the litigator on those cases, so I shouldn't really speak to them. But I think that the courts, the court of public opinion and the courts of law are definitely one place we go. I think you take for granted, but it's important to emphasize what you say, that, you know, this is selective enforcement. This isn't because black and brown people use drugs at higher rates. This isn't because in certain cities or in Manhattan, you know, the rates of use are 11-to-1. It's because of choices that are made by law enforcement in terms of how they police. And so I think it, you know, it comes down to us, and there I say the us or the we is not us litigators, but us as voters and constituents, to make it really clear that we won't stand for that. And I think our prosecutors, again, you know, have the authority as the law enforcement official in their jurisdiction to go to the police and say, why are you bringing me all these drug cases from this single zip code? Like, why are you doing this? And so I really think it comes down to sort of holding those in power to account. But that's complicated.
Are there any questions? Yes, gentleman there in the blue tie.
Thank you. Hi. I spend a lot of my time representing people who sell drugs. I'm a criminal defense lawyer. And so it's not about patients so much with me. And what I've observed speaking to heroin dealers or crack dealers is that most of them think the worst thing they ever did in their life was sell drugs to people. And that's to all the users and addicts and people of color who are, you know, now trapped in a dependency and subject to arrest. So a couple things. What do you propose we do with the drug traffickers? They should still be criminalized, I think. And then if you did wave the wand of legalizing possession, that doesn't really fix this problem of disparity, does it? There has to be some other kind of coordinated program of outreach to help people who are in need that is, you know, not merely limited to legalizing small amounts of drugs for possession. Wouldn't you say?
That's a question to me, I'm guessing.
All of you.
So let's put the question out as what do we do with the dealers? Because there's a reality, there's a paradox. In order to be a legal possessor of a legal quantity of marijuana or any other drug, you have to buy it from somebody who's committing a very serious felony by selling it to you, by transporting it to you. And some would say they're doing a public service in the case of marijuana, but others would say that that is a terrible criminal thing to do. I'm not sure exactly why I spent my whole life thinking about it, but I think governments generally have especially the United States government has a strong desire not to allow people to set up underground financial networks of armed men and women to undermine their police authority. How do we get the drugs to people without creating this drug kingpin culture that they're so worried about?
I can't speak as the State Department of Health necessarily, but I think Mr. Cole laid it out in terms of marijuana, and that by extension could be, you could do that for all drugs. That's not the approach in the New York State Department of Health. But if you wanted to approach it, you would take out the financial incentives from anyone to have to sell drugs, and you would regulate the market, which again is not New York State Department of Health's position. But you could do that, and that is probably, instead of just decriminalizing drugs, you regulate them. But in terms of drug dealers, I think there has to be a differentiation between those people who are doing it for basic economics and for those people who are supporting their own drug use, because those folks to me fall into the category of people that need support and a way out of what they're doing, as opposed to some higher level importer or cartel affiliated group or dealers. And I think that again the prosecutor position is trying to figure out when they prosecute and when they don't, and to unravel that, because it's not always very clear. But I mean, I don't know. I could ask other people should answer, but I'd like you to say, from your experience, the dealers that you defend, what is their economic and personal histories?
Mandatory, 10-year mandatory minimums in federal cases usually. The last marijuana case I tried was a 7-ton marijuana case. Fortunately, after losing, we got a 15-month sentence, far below the federal guidelines. The people who I represent in heroin and cocaine importation schemes are oftentimes involved in very large quantities as well. And do we now begin to look at them more as like a black marketeer or someone who's selling goods without a tax stamp? Are they now less like a drug trafficker if we're legalizing drugs for all purposes?
You know, I had an opportunity to visit Argentina in Buenos Aires, and I met a drug treatment doctor, professional, and he told me that a story about being taken blindfolded by helicopter to a mountaintop in Bolivia, where he met a guy who lived in a castle, and he said, you wouldn't believe what corporation this man personally owns. He can't tell you, but you wouldn't believe it. He said, the reason I was there was because his son was addicted to cocaine. And he looked at me and he said, do you think that drug traffickers don't have addiction problems too? Which I thought was interesting. I don't know if that answers your question, but I thought it was interesting, and it reminded me of that story. But maybe Andrew could talk about that a little bit, because you do address, in a way, your treatment about harm reduction, the idea of reducing harm is more important than putting people in jail.
Well, what this discussion makes me think about is how successful, maybe starting with Harry Anslinger, or even before with Prohibition, but certain forces in society have been at demonizing drugs and drug users, dehumanizing drug users and the people that are affiliated with them. And, you know, we're talking about stigma, but, you know, we are all, you know, we've grown up, you know, in a culture that's infused with these dehumanizing, demonizing images of drug users. And I think that that's then serves as a kind of a emotional justification for this abysmal, catastrophic, impact of the drug war and the criminalization of drugs. So, yeah, from a psychological standpoint, these are human beings who are struggling with all sorts of life issues, who find drugs to be helpful in some way, and many of them do just fine and never come to anybody. The majority of them, of drug users, many of whom are in this room, are doing very well in their lives, and some people begin to get into trouble. But I think that until we really confront that we've got this horrible, stigmatizing, really dehumanized infusion. It's like it lives inside of all of us, so that we just sit by while the American equivalent of the Soviet Gulag. We're living in the midst of this. It's just horrific. And so then, there's no outcry when President Trump, makes a friendly call to Duterte, which is just like the most bizarre thing we can imagine. But where's the outcry? Because we've all grown up basically assuming that drug users are like insects, right? So they deserve what they get. But they're, our mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers and friends, and so we need to have a fundamental change in the narrative about drugs in this country. I mean, I think George Soros should put, a few $1 million into a massive re-education campaign to humanize the face of drug users, and that's going to be the basis. I mean, this is what Mr. Cole was talking about when he said that it's the people that need to change and and to have an impact on our prosecutors and our people in government who will then change policies.
And I would just really quickly piggyback on that to say that I think, the line is a fallacy between simple personal use and possession and low-level drug dealing. And I think a lot of what we see, again, especially at the state level where the magnitude of these arrests and prosecutions are occurring for drug distribution or drug dealing or possession with intent to distribute is really, about drug use ultimately. It's not the federal prosecutions. I do think, though, that we know, it's been 4.5 decades now since the war on drugs was declared, and it hasn't solved the problems. And we know that the prohibitionist regime has driven not only drug use underground, but has also really fueled the cartels and, the sort of illegal drug trade itself, and made it more dangerous and made it more lucrative and made it more violent. So I definitely think, one, we can't sort of pretend that we can divide the sea. And two, we need to think carefully because what we're doing isn't working, and the way we throw the book, to use Mr. Cole's term, at most drug distribution offenses right now, I think is really over the top, and it's removing, those mandatory minima are removing the discretion from those who should have it.
And I also think, I think it's really important that we are, in these conversations, in these rooms, are not afraid to say, like, what is the real vision that we want to see, right? It's easy to say, oh, the poor people that are using small amounts of drugs, they don't deserve to go to jail. And I think a lot of people can agree to that. But if we're really talking about transformative change, completely eliminating the way that mass incarceration works in this country, changing dramatically the way that drug use and drug users are perceived in this country, we can't be afraid to say, we want to see full regulation of all drugs, and that even the way that heroin is being used in New York City, so many of our folks that are coming in are getting sick or overdosing because of fentanyl and because they don't know what is in their drugs, and there's no real way for them to know what they're taking and to really use in a more safe way if everything is underground, if everything is so deregulated, and there's no efforts to make sure that people are safe and that safety is first.
Mm-hmm. Just a comment about that. I don't know if people in the room are aware that there are a number of countries that are offering heroin maintenance programs. And I've met some people who are on heroin maintenance programs in Canada and in England. And what I heard from these different people was that they had been on many, many different treatments over the years, all of which failed And the heroin maintenance was the first treatment that enabled them to stabilize their lives. And they had done so over a number of years. So, I mean, when we think about heroin, I mean, I bet that for most people in the room, this kind of disgust comes over you, and this is a demon drug. Well, for these patients and these programs, this has been life-saving. This is just one example of what becomes possible when we start to really challenge this basic demonizing assumption about certain drugs bad, certain drugs good, certain drug users bad, et cetera.
That's true. I mean, we don't, yes, go ahead.
I want to ask a question about the opioid epidemic. Just throw this out to the panel off the topics we were just discussing. Do you, as I do in both in my practice and my interactions professionally, as well as with people who struggle with when you're interacting with people who have opioid issues, substance abuse, dependence disorder, that this is really a moment where we as activists or those of us who have been advocating for more fair drug laws can reach out and unify, because this is something that is affecting everyone for the most part in this country. Almost everyone knows somebody who's been impacted by this. So do you see this as the opportunity it is to move forward with a more progressive drug policy agenda?
I think it's an opportunity, but it's also a really big risk, because you have people like Chris Christie who are going to be in charge of sort of pushing through the opioid policy for the United States, right? And so, you know, I really did appreciate, you know, your sort of 10-point policy recommendations. The first thing you had on there was safe consumption spaces, supervised injection facilities, and, you know, the tour I was referring to earlier, we did this like pop-up exhibit in New York City and in a bunch of cities across the state. To really say what does that look like? What would that mean for bringing them into New York, and really trying to unify sort of this new emerging population that is impacted by opioids. And I think the potential there, and I think that's why it's really important. There is a lot of potential, but I think it's really important that we're leading with some of those really kind of controversial, tough solutions, because if we don't, we're going to get more mandated treatment, more law enforcement, more failed drug war policies that really haven't helped or served or proven to work in the last 40 years.
I want to follow, oh, go ahead, there's another question over here, yes. We want to get it on the tape, that's why.
So, you know, we've talked about how there's racial disparities in how people are, you know, persecuted for using drugs, but are, you know, and now the perception of the drug problem as more of a white, you know, drug epidemic is driving more access to treatment or more of a public health approach. But what do you see as the disparities that still exist in the way people access that treatment? Like, are we seeing the same racial disparities there?
Anybody want to take that?
I can say I don't know. But you would assume so. You would. I mean, the thing is with drug treatment, it's that if you had the drug treatment that you wanted, that if it was available, there's not enough of it. So it doesn't matter who you are, you can't access it. And I don't know. I don't know if what the racial impacts are around accessing drug treatment, but I would make the assumption that if you have racial disparities in every other healthcare system, you would have it within drug treatment too.
Well, and you also have tremendous economic disparities. I mean, you know, the kinds of treatments that I'm talking about are being offered in a number of places around the country, but that are generally in private settings, that are not publicly funded, that, you know, need paying customers or people with very good insurance. For example, I'm actually on the medical and clinical advisory panels of OASAS, the Office of Alcoholism and Substance Use Treatment. They say that abstinence is not a requirement for state certification. I was shocked to hear that when I first joined one of these panels. But everybody, most of the people who are offering treatments on the ground believe that that's a state regulation. So There is a wonderful program for those that may be looking for good treatment in Brooklyn that is run by Housing Works, which is the one and only OASIS licensed program that is infused with harm reduction thinking. I've been working with them for the last 5 years. But so these new ideas are starting to creep into the treatment field, but most treatments are really old school and not evidence-based and have these old kind of punitive failed ideas. And the system, not only even well-meaning treatment programs are underfunded, the staff are underpaid, they're undertrained. I mean, so, you know, the stigma of toward drug users extends to the drug treatment system. I forget what it was. Somebody pointed out in a recent talk that, remember a few years ago, somebody had a problem with a baby carriage? And then there was this multi-million-dollar effort to, you know, figure out what was wrong with the baby carriage and, you know, put safety standards in. But we have, you know, with all of the outcry about our drug and overdose epidemics, we have minimal real action to provide state-of-the-art care for folks.
Can I just give another example?
Go right ahead.
There isn't a single, apart from outpatient in Manhattan, there isn't a single drug treatment program that is based around LGBT issues. So if you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, a person transgender experience, there's no treatments for you, no sensitive drug treatment program that you can access. We provided support for one of our needle exchange programs in Ithaca, and they hired a buprenorphine prescriber. She can only prescribe to 30 patients because it's her first year. Although she can prescribe as many opiates as she wants to as many people she wants, she can only prescribe the solution in the first year to 30 people. In 3 days, in 15 hours, she filled those 30 slots in the drug treatment program, in the needle exchange program, and has 60 people on the waiting list. So it's not that there's a lack of desire amongst people who use drugs to manage the drugs they use. There's not a lack of desire on the part of people to protect themselves from the drugs that are out there. There's a lack of ability to access the medications and the drugs they need to protect themselves. It's insane.
Yeah, just another piece of evidence to support that. The federal government does an annual household survey of drugs and health, and they look at the use of drugs and access to treatment. And there's one really interesting statistic that I read, I think it was in the 2015 household survey, and that is they identified the group of people that wanted treatment, needed treatment and wanted treatment but didn't access it, and they asked them why not. Close to 40% said that they did not want to stop. That supports my contention that, you know, we have an abstinence-based treatment system, and I would say more than 40% of active people who are concerned don't want to stop. So that's a major shortcoming of the treatment system. But then there were 4 others, and I can't remember the exact statistics, but 2 of them were insurance won't cover it, can't afford it. And the others were a fear of what would happen if neighbors or my job found out. So there's, you know, abstinence only, there's the economics of it, and there's stigma.
Can I just sound one really quick alarm bell, echoing and picking up on that, is that I think in the criminal justice system, there has, I think, you know, the sort of revelation around opiate use being a white problem has indeed been a politic moment and opened up the space for conversation advocacy. I also think, though, there's a real risk that slides into the equation of drug use with disease and addiction and the need for treatment, and that it then becomes judges and prosecutors who define what treatment is appropriate. And I think that's really, really dangerous. We see that in drug courts especially, which I have many feelings about that we don't have time to talk through now. But to the racial disparities piece, we also see that drug court participation and other diversion programs are by and large offered to white defendants at greater rates than Black and brown and Latino defendants. So we see the racial disparities, we see the move away from doctors and users who really should be the ones deciding if they want treatment, and then if so, what that treatment really means. And I just think that there's the opportunity for the coercive state to be increasingly coercive, and I just want to make sure that as we talk about this, we don't, somehow slip towards involuntary commitment, because I think that's a real.
We're going to go to the next question. It just sounds to me, just in a moment, that like a system that forgot really why it got set up a long time ago, and it's something like out of a Star Trek episode. Or man in the purple. Oh, here, back here. Okay, over here, and then you're next.
Thank you to the panel for being here. For Dr. Tatarsky, some of the things that you've discussed are the effectiveness of current addiction treatment protocols. There's a bit of a chicken or egg problem with respect to whether punitive laws dissuade people from seeking treatment, or whether seeking the treatment itself, when there's not, in general, a great effective rate of success, is a problem. But if you look at treatment for alcohol addiction, for example, a legal substance where the outcomes aren't that great either, and the problem is growing even as the substance has been legal for a long time. You've touched on the idea of social stigma and shame being a big problem. What do you think an effective public awareness campaign around that to target that kind of problem would be? And do you think that there's one currently being waged that has much traction at this point?
Wow, those are great, important questions. I don't think one is being waged. I mean, it seems to me that we all have relationships with substances, and we all have relationships with substances that sometimes become problematic. And I mean, I think that we need a whole different shift in the way that we think about the complexity of our relationships to substances, so that people who have problematic relationships to substances are not necessarily drug abusers or addicts. We all have, struggle with our relationship to sugar and to fat and to salt and to alcohol at some point or another. So we need to redefine the way that we think about substance use and people who use substances, which is all of us. So that kind of campaign needs to happen, and it certainly is not happening. I'm not sure what the other questions were that you asked. Was there something else that you wanted me to address?
Basically, what do you think an effective campaign would look like for that? Because like you've mentioned, there are many, many substances that are legal that you could group into that kind of category of substances that have problematic use levels that are not effectively being addressed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this should all be cast in terms of our relationship to health-related behaviors. We are not taught how to use substances properly. We're taught to not use substances, and then when we're legal, we get to use them, but there's never been any education in how to use substances safely. That's a harm reduction approach. That presumes that people will engage in risky behavior. We ski, we drive, we scuba dive, we do all sorts of things that are very, very dangerous, and we go through training programs to learn how to do these things. We should be educating people about the proper use of substances, including alcohol, in junior high school, in preparation for, and about the real risks of drug use in developing brains. But so we've like proscribed honest education in the risks and the benefits of substances, which will actually arm people with skills and knowledge that will enable them to make conscious, healthy choices about their use of substances. So we need a whole other, there are some really progressive drug education programs that have been developed, and education programs based on these principles for parents, for example, safety first. I mean, so there are some resources out there, but they're not widely enough disseminated.
Okay. Okay, we have I haven't forgotten you, but we have another one right ahead, so go ahead.
Excuse me. I think we need in New York, we need a lot of education because like out in Jamaica, they only got one harm reduction out there. Okay, so you got to remember, people that's on drugs, they need a spot they can go right to, you know. And look at Long Island, Westchester County, and how they've been hit really bad, okay? So we have to think about putting more harm reductions out there because that's the only sources we have to do with dealing with drug users. I used to be a drug user, but I'm not. I've been in office about maybe 30 years now, and I learned from drug users. And I think drug users need to be working with drug users.
And I'd like to follow up that question with the whole idea of what is the role of the drug user themselves in their own cure or in their own treatment or in their own stabilization of their lives and continuation of use if they wish.
Yeah, I mean, I think one really positive thing is there has been a lot of investment in harm reduction programs over the last several years, and we're continuing to get more investment, which is great, and so that we can expand our syringe exchange programs. And ultimately, when people come into our door, they may be involved in chaotic drug use, but the thing that when they're saying, what do you need the most? It'll probably be a house, a job, mental health services, and I think the more that we can have sort of these holistic approaches to really meeting people's needs, the drug use is kind of a small part in a much bigger array of problems that people are facing on an everyday basis.
Can I just, New York City used to be the epicenter of injection drug use and HIV in the world. And then we started doing syringe exchange programs. And what people don't really think about so much is that you can start a program, but you need people to show up to use those programs. So we reversed, this might be the one place in the world where we completely turned around and reversed an HIV epidemic, but it wasn't done by government, it wasn't done by social service providers, it was done by drug users themselves. Similarly, we know that 60% of overdose cases, when someone overdoses, 60% of drug users have witnessed a drug overdose, which is why we rolled out naloxone and put it into the hands of the people who are there on the scene first. And we think about first responders as being law enforcement, a fire department. Drug users are the first responders. So many drug users have taken things into their hands and rescued their loved ones, their friends, their family members. And we tend to think of drug users as being incompetent, debilitated people, but you put tools into the hands of drug users and they use them responsibly and they do the right thing. We just need to give drug users the autonomy that they need to do the things they need to do.
Okay, next question.
Everyone, thanks for coming out, really appreciate it. I guess this goes out to Ms. Borden, but also the floor as well. I think one underlying issue that really doesn't get discussed enough in the public discourse, I think purposefully, is kind of the numerous industries that can rely on drug criminalization and prohibition and profit off of it, whether it's prisons or law enforcement agencies or pharmaceutical industries and so on and so forth. So how does that inform kind of your strategies in trying to find, if at all, when trying to kind of figure out what's the most effective way in pushing forward real reform?
Yeah, that's a great question, and definitely I think hits the nail on the head in terms of a problem. I think you're asking basically about advocacy and theories of change, which is a long answer. I think sometimes we think about what will have the most impact. I think sometimes we think about who can we pass the torch to, who can take this and run with it. This is not just as ACLUers, but as advocates more generally. I think the privatization of the criminal industrial complex is a real one. And I also think it's one that at least ACLU members and our audience has felt quite passionate about. The ACLU and Color of Change just released a terrific report on the privatization of pretrial detention and release in the bail bond industry, which I encourage you to look at. I think we're seeing that privatization not just in the prison systems, but in increasingly, the bail bonds industry and conditions of release. When people are released pretrial, we're also seeing it, of course, in privatized probation and that whole industry. And I think as that maps on to drug offenses, it means increasingly, as we're layering on conditions of, probation, for example, that involve, drug counseling and, anger management and all these things, and then you privatize that, you're just incentivizing, first of all, putting more people into the system to funnel them out into the program, and then failure of that program so that you can keep them in and keep them paying those fines for participation. So I think the privatization piece is big. But I also think, the private companies that are involved in these systems are essentially fulfilling government functions, and the fact that the government function is so self-sustaining of that, handcuffed to prison system is really problematic too. So that's again why I say, it's not just the drug possession piece, it's not just the drug offenses piece, it's, the whole over-criminalization and over-policed communities that we're looking at more generally.
Yeah, no, I also have another comment that this makes me think about, maybe also relative to the question you had, is I've thought about how part of, the way this addiction recovery narrative is infused in our culture is in what I call the tyranny of abstinence only. And that lives in the criminal, once you've been identified as an illegal drug user, then abstinence only comes down on you. Once you've been identified as a problematic drug user, abstinence only comes down on you, and that infuses the treatment system. So, and this, I think, may be another part, a very important part of the public re-education. That is, that instead of abstinence only, we need to embrace that people begin making positive change wherever they're ready to begin making it, and generally while they're still engaging in those behaviors. And abstinence only is going to work against people telling their bosses, telling their friends, telling their partners, telling their doctors that they're using drugs. Because the concern is, you're going to judge me, you're going to tell me I have to stop, and if I'm not ready to stop, then I'm not going to tell you. So that serves to further alienate people and drive them into isolation with shame, guilt, etc. Now, the final piece about the privatization is the business of recovery, which is an incredibly important film that Greg Horvath did, looking at the selling of recovery through multi-million-dollar recovery treatment centers. So that's another business that is invested in this whole addiction recovery narrative.
All right, how much time do we have?
I think we have 4 questions with people with their hands up. We have time for that, but I would ask that people keep their questions succinct, please, because it's about 8:20, and I think our audience is thinning here. So just be respectful of the time and our panelists as well as the audience.
Sure, let's go start. We'll start on that side and come back. Wait, no, she's not now, Dana. Wait, give 1 minute. Noah, who was one of the organizers of the event.
Won't take the mic. Yeah, hi. Thanks for your all coming out. My question is about the takeaway from tonight. We've had the committee's done many events. We've had a lot of enlightening conversations, and then everybody goes home. So it's a little bit late in the program to ask if there's any synthesis that you can achieve among all the different things that have been said. And the topic is the Trump administration, and we may not be speaking to the Trump administration, notwithstanding what Mr. Cole said, but if the matter at hand is there's a Trump administration, and then do we all talk to the city government or the state government? Who would be your audience if you were to give the wish list? I think that's for everybody. The wish list for new policies and particular legal, statutory or regulatory change, to what address would you send those, and what would those requests be?
You say, what would those requests be, or who would they go to?
And where would they go? They're, I think, linked.
I mean, I think our legislative wish list is not much different from the 10 points that you guys outlined at the beginning of the program. And I mean, I think it's really just the mayor in the city council. We have a progressive mayor, city council. and we need to make sure that they're actually moving through on the things that they said they would do, right? Marijuana arrests went up in the last year. Why is that happening? Why is that happening under a mayor who campaigned on ending stop and frisk and ending racially biased marijuana arrests? You have a study that's happening that is being funded by the New York City Council to evaluate whether supervised injection facilities, supervised consumption spaces are feasible in New York City. I think that's a report, but I think it's a political moment. And it really is going to take investment. You see the way that the de Blasio administration is responding to opioids. A big portion of that is going into the NYPD, and that needs to be, you need to push back about it. You can't have, I think it's really important for us and a myriad of issues to not have our politicians saying how terrible and awful Trump is, while at the same time not taking the political risks to really enact change that they can do right now. And so, I mean, those are, I think, in New York for now, you know, we've been fighting a lot of the same fights, and we have a little bit more leverage because you have a governor who has political ambitions, and you have a mayor who is ultimately running unopposed this year, right? And so, and I think it's also putting some heat on the prosecutors. So in our C4 capacity, we're really interested in the Brooklyn DA race. And it's exciting to see that you have the candidates kind of outflanking each other on the left. And, you know, as was mentioned earlier in Philadelphia, you have Larry Krasner, who won, and who ran on a reform agenda. And I think that there's a lot of leverage points. Ultimately, like, Trump is not going to be our guy, but how can we make sure that, you know, we're not letting go of the gas on our so-called progressive champions who could do a lot more than they're doing right now?
Okay.
Is there anybody who hasn't already asked a question who would like to ask a question? If not, I'll open the floor. We can go back to the people who've already asked. And I saw a few hands up. Dana, I'll get to you in a moment. Sir, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I have a general question for the panel, more specifically, I guess it's up to the moderator. Some people don't know, or it hasn't been talked about today, as to a country just to our north, as a matter of fact, our largest trade partner, Canada. Last month, Justin Trudeau, the equivalent of a Donald Trump, at least as far as being head of the state, introduced a bill into Canadian Parliament to legalize small amounts of marijuana throughout the entire country, and depending upon whether or not that is, you know, basically voted up by the Parliament, we don't know if we're going to have about 3,000 miles almost of border in common with a country that has legalized marijuana for leisure use. I guess my question to the panel is, I know my question to the panel is that, being that the topic of this is the effect on the Trump administration of what it is actually the action of drugs in this country, the usage of drugs in this country is, how is that going to inform us as a country as opposed to the litmus test of states? How is that going to inform us as to state regulation? How is that going to inform us as to public health teaching? How is it going to inform us as to criminal justice system use? In that country just to the north of us, that has in common with it Washington State as having legalized leisure marijuana, Maine as a state having legalized leisure marijuana, and perhaps Vermont soon.
North Dakota. Well, you know, you don't have to look to the north. We can look to the south, because I believe Mexico just passed some laws decriminalizing marijuana and other drugs in Mexico as well. Yeah, right. So the United States is becoming, some of the most conservative countries in the world are coming along and joining the Netherlands and California and Colorado for sure. While at the same time we have the Philippines under Duarte. So Duarte, is that it? Duarte. I'll get it right.
Because he's been mentioned a whole lot. We've got a lot more in common with Canada than we do in the Philippines.
Obviously we see a split on this issue, and around the world, and it's splitting. Different leaders are taking different positions, and you know, I think we didn't get into it, and maybe it's for the best. It's the end of the event. That the fact is that drugs have been used as a tool for achieving other goals that have very little to do with drugs. So sometimes when a bunch of drug treatment people and professionals get together and start talking about drugs from the point of view of we're going to solve this problem, we're totally on a different planet from the people who actually hold the authority, who have some other goal in mind. Unfortunately, sometimes that's social control, it's racial disparity, it's, we have to look at our country, maybe a country like South Africa, settler states that were settled by people who came from other countries and displaced the people who were here and brought in people as slaves to work. We have to look at that history and wonder what our laws today, have in common with the laws that we were founded on.
Did we answer the question, though?
Yes, you may.
Well, no, I think that the last two questions are linked a little bit, because if you go back to when we started doing syringe exchange, we did it under George Bush I and George Bush II and the Newt Gingrich Congress. There's a lot of change that can be made on the local level and the state level, and progressive change. In those days, we had no contact pretty much with anyone in the administration. So I think that the difference now is that, A, we know we can continue to make progressive change on the state and local level, and we have grown up a little bit and have contacts within the administration. So I think that politically, Canada was very much more progressive than the US before Harper, and then Harper came along and they just rolled everything back, which is what we're going to see with Trump. And now Trudeau's come along, and the bounce, whatever it is, the bounce is now that they're importing heroin for heroin trials, they're opening supervised injection facilities, and potentially legalizing marijuana, which I think will bolster those states in the U.S. that have gone ahead and legalized marijuana for pleasure. I don't know that it's going to, but I also don't know at the same time that what they do in Canada makes any difference to what they do in the U.S., if that makes sense. I guess I've just said two things, that polar opposites. But I don't think it hurts us. I think it'll help us.
Any more questions, Dana?
I think that, these terrible times also are sparking and fueling the passion and the creativity of the progressive forces, the forces for positive change. So even in the Philippines, I have done some work there, and we have some wonderful colleagues there. They run an organization called No Box Transitions in Manila, and they are very connected to elements in the Philippine government that are working toward creating positive change, and they've told me that there may be really a series of opportunities to create a model. So it's coming from a horrible place, 1 million people driven to treatment at the fear of losing their lives, and yet now they need to figure out what kind of treatment to use. So we can supply a model, and I think that there are a lot of very progressive things happening around this country that will feel supported and emboldened by the developments in Canada and Mexico and Colombia, and it's just happening all over the world, rolling. So.
Any other questions?
Dana has one. I saw Doug had his hand up. I actually have a follow-up to what this gentleman over here asked, and what I'm hearing off the panel is everybody saying, well, the people in power are preventing us from, this is a reduction, but the elected officials are not, have political concerns, and so we have some leverage, but we're not able to move forward. Well, then isn't it incumbent upon voters and us as attorneys and activists and organizers within the community to put elected officials in office then who mirror the views of the people? Because most people, and the data backs this up, are for decriminalization, at least of, or full legalization of marijuana, definitely 80%, I believe, for medicinal purposes, and 60% for adult use. And when you start discussing about the opioid epidemic, most people, the recommendations that we have in this letter, a lot of people will come on board with that, because people know people who have been impacted by chemical dependence, by disparate prosecution, and these issues. So isn't it, I guess my question is, isn't it incumbent upon us then to work to put politicians in office who share our values as a country, as a city, as whatever locality we are in.
Yes.
And just
make sure that the people who these policies impact can vote, and that is a problem.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I think just to build off that and just to highlight a campaign that's happening in New York is Chris from the Drug Policy Alliance, and is really helping to lead a full tax and regulate bill that will be introduced this session in New York. And a lot of I don't think de Blasio is he's not publicly for tax and regulate. Cuomo definitely is not, and they're sort of wavering on decriminalization. And I think it's important to get these guys on the record and to sort of hammer them. And I think you've seen a lot of change. A lot of politicians are more willing to say that they're for tax and regulate even more than, say, 5 years ago. But, it's something that needs to continue to be pushed. And I think for drug policy, obviously, is important in this room, but for a lot of sort of just the broader progressive movement, they're not really thinking about the drug war, marijuana legalization as their core issues, right? I think a lot of our affordable housing partners or education or the sort of the general world of people who we fight with, when we talk about drugs, they're a little bit nervous and unsure, and I think that goes back to stigma and all of these other things. So I think it's important to continue to highlight the seriousness of the drug war and why legalization is a racial justice, social justice, economic issue that everyone should be concerned about.
Hi. Many people on the...
You have a question.
Well, you got to put it close to my mouth. Many people on the panel know me. My name is Dana Beal, and I work with ACT UP, and I'm working with the meth treatment group right now. New York has set up a harm reduction program for meth users where they're allowing people to use meth. And in that, I'm the guy that's advocating anti-craving meds. See, there's two ways of doing this. There's the abstinence-based thing, and then there's drug maintenance. But what about in between, where we use a drug to get people off of drugs? They're then going to be abstinent. Well, it turns out there isn't a huge lobby for that. And I just want to ask one question. The drug I'm talking about basically costs about $100 a dose and gets people off of heroin and methamphetamine overnight. It's Ibogaine. Why would somebody like Robert Ganji, who's from the New York Correctional Association, who his big issue is broken windows and police misconduct, why would he not connect that to having better treatment? In other words, he doesn't see the solution to police misconduct and criminalization in a big breakthrough in treatment.
Dana, you have 5 seconds to wrap up to a pointed question.
Why is that?
Thank you.
Well, he's running for mayor, so you can ask him at one of those forums. But I think that I think it's important for us as harm reductionists to, get out of our silos, to talk about solutions to a wide range of folks. And, we're probably not talking about broken windows policing in all of our panels, so it's something that we all kind of have to develop and grow.
So we have time for one more question. One more question.
We have time for one more. I've seen Doug has his hand up for a while.
Doug Green he's one of the most knowledgeable people I know on this issue. Is the gentleman in the front row? We all know him, Doug Green. Go right ahead, Doug. And we should give you a big hand because you've dedicated your whole life to this. I've known you for many years. You're really one of the great activists, even though you're shy and you never do the public thing. You're great.
It's about getting the work done, Paul. Thank you, and thank you all for being here. So my closing question is, I guess, both for Alyssa and for Allan. You're coming from it from two perspectives now. You both had your roots in activism. But that's the question of, can you tell our audience what is going on in New York with drug consumption rooms and safe injection facilities? I know there's a lot of action going on, and I know, Allan, you can't speak for the Department of Health, but perhaps you can give us some insight in what's going on. I've spoken to some people, actually a former director of the AIDS Institute, who is very pessimistic about the chances for something happening in the near future.
Yeah, I can't. Supervised injection facilities are not something New York State Department of Health supports. But if you think about when we started in New York State, started talking about syringe exchange, it was in 1985. There were serious considerations for syringe exchange through the 80s. Then there was a pilot program. The legality of them was questioned. The morality of them was questioned. Everything about them was questioned. And then we did it, and it completely reversed and changed what has gone on around HIV in New York State. It was a lifesaver. So I think there's analogies there. And it was done by activists in the end that pushed the agenda. Activists took to the streets and took healthcare to the streets and did it that way.
What an amazing note to end this event on. I still want to give everybody a chance for any last words, but that I think is our ending note right there. But anyone else like to say something to wrap up our event today?
I guess to speak from SIFs from the non-government perspective, I mean, I think, yeah, I mean, a lot of us are hoping to learn from the way that syringe exchange developed in New York City, and there's a lot of momentum. You know, it's something that I think it was really surprising when we sort of went on this tour across the state, that you would have parents who'd lost children, police officers, prosecutors, kind of really interested in the concept, a little bit nervous, but I think people definitely see a need, and I think it's all about how do we humanize people enough to say, if you're using drugs, but our primary concern is that you stay alive, and if we can move that narrative forward, then I think that we can win and get SIFs or safe consumption spaces in New York. Obviously, there's a whole like political agenda there that requires lots of moving parts, and you know, we'll see. But for those that are interested, you know, there's been a lot of really wonderful healthcare providers that have said, you know, health professionals for SIFs, and you know, I think that there's a lot of legal challenges that are going to come. So maybe we can have lawyers for SIFs too.
Anyone else? Yes, Tess.
I'm just smiling. Lawyers for SIFs. And activists to the street. I mean, I really think it's about lifting up those voices.
How can we get your book every 25 seconds?
Sorry?
How can we get your book?
I like that you keep calling it a book. It's like a paperweight. It's really big. You can download it on aclu.org or hrw.org, or you can Google every 25 seconds, and it will take you to those links.
Right.
Or you can come relieve me of the copies in my purse.
Any other? We will. Any shameless plugs? This is the time for it right now.
Well, I would just ask if there's anyone in the room that is a addiction treatment or research or education professional or knows of any who would like to sign on to our letter. I would invite you to give me a business card or, you know, get in touch with me. My email is atatarskiphd@cfol.org. That's our center, is Center for Optimal Living. But this is an effort by a much larger group of people from across the country who are really leaders in the field. So if you'd like, or if you know of anyone who would like to join this effort, please let me know.
Great. And so I like to encourage folks to check out my show, Let Them Talk, on Manhattan Neighborhood Network every Tuesday night live at 8 p.m., or my show on WBAI, also live 6:30 p.m. every Thursday. And thank you all for coming. We had a great time. It was very informative, and thank you for your participation. You're a great audience, one of the best audiences I've ever moderated, which aren't too many. So thank you very much.
And I would just like to take a moment on behalf of the committee to thank all of our amazing panelists and our amazing moderator and the incredible people in the audience who have stuck it out for over 2.5 hours, I think, at this point. Thank you all for coming up, asking your questions, and for your continued commitment. So have a fabulous Memorial Day weekend. Thank you for attending, and please read our letter and give this incredible panel and our moderator a hand.